All right, so now that it's being recorded, it's official. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for making time on a Friday afternoon to think important problems with us through. I'm Héctor Hoyos. I am directing Modern Thought and Literature. I'll be introducing, moderating, facilitating. Let me read some of the, rightly extensive bios of our distinguished guests today, who are experts on the subject that we're going to talk about in more ways than one. Laura Goode, she is the author of 2 books, the poetry collection Become a Name and the young adult novel Sister Mischief. She co-wrote and produced the feature film Farrah Goes Bang, which premiered at Tribeca and won the Nora Ephron Prize from Tribeca, also from Vogue. Her nonfiction work has been honored with fellowships from San Jose State University, Bread Loaf Writers Conference, has appeared in BuzzFeed, The Cut, Catapult, Refinery 29, Elle, Glamour, In Style, New Republics, and Long Reads, and several anthologies. And it's worth dwelling on all of this presence that Laura has in public writing, because this is also what she's been doing for Stanford for a little while now. And we're very appreciative for her guidance. After receiving her BA and MFA from Columbia, she is officially the Associate Director for the Graduate Humanities Public Writing Project at Stanford University. That is the full name. And we are also in the great company of Antony Ocampo. First thing everyone should know about Professor Ocampo is he is an MTL alum who knows a lot about how things looked like in the early 2000s, and we were just chatting about it. It's I hope you have time to chat more with Professor Ocampo. He is an associate professor of sociology and a provost fellow at CalPoly Pomona, which is pretty much heaven on earth. It has amazing weather and many other advantages that I'd love to hear more about. He is also the faculty director of the Cal State University Chancellor's Doctoral Incentive Program, the author of a Stanford University Press book connected to his time at MTL, The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race. It's a very insightful study that reframes how we think about ethnicity and quote unquote minority writing. It's something that I highly recommend that people who are working in FemGen and race and ethnicity take a look at, especially in our program in MTL. His research has been published in Ethnic and Racial Studies, Context, Journal of the Ethnic and Migration Studies, Latino Studies, to name only a few of the venues, but he is also featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, NPR Morning Edition, Latino USA, NBC News, and others, and is presently working on, or finishing rather, Brown and Gay in LA, Queer Sons of Immigrant Coming of Age, to be published with NYU Press. Thank you guys for coming. This is like a virtual clap.
Yay!
All right, so let me share with everyone the questions that I pre-circulated with Antony and Laura. Questions to get the conversation started about the big picture. What does it mean to be an academic online? Coda in the year of the Lord 2021, which might differ from the answer a couple of years ago. This month's Harper Index reports the estimated amount of carbon in metric tons produced each year by the sending and receiving of emails is 12 million, as in 12 million metric tons of carbon. So, every now and then in water cooler conversations, academics will say, oh, but we fly so much in and out for conferences. What are we doing to ourselves and to the planet? And yet there you have the fact of the digital infrastructure that is making this very encounter possible. So I would like to hear from our speakers what they think about, the big question. And let me ask you, Anthony and Laura, if you prefer that we go kind of like question by question, since we have a little bit of a cheat sheet, or if I should read the questions now and then pass it over to each of you, as you prefer.
I defer to Professor Ocampo.
No, I think going through the questions work. I think Laura and I, we've been texting about how to best answer all of this stuff in the most organic way possible. And we were chatting, like we both have slides just in case, or examples, what do I call it? Like illustrative examples of like that address some of the questions. So yeah.
Great. So well, then let's start by that one, right? So what is the meaning of being an academic online in light of the structural reality, right? The farms, the server farms, wearing 24/7, dragging water to be cooled. Is it a case of like bad consciousness, as Sartre would think, and that's what we're doing here, like relieving our bad consciousness for the real costs of what we do, or how should we even think about this? And it's an honest question. It's not rhetorical. I have no idea how to answer it.
What do you think, Anthony? The climate change,
oh my gosh,
the climate change dimension of this feels like an incredibly daunting, like, should we be sending emails? Well, I don't know, I don't know if they're worth that much to me. Like,
yeah, it's so different. It's let me just to give you a sense of my timeline. I left Stanford in 2003, 2004, and by then Facebook had just started. So we had miscellaneous social networking sites that were, I mean, more for fun, if any, like the MySpace. Did you know like MySpace, Friendster? What do you call it? Before that, we had AOL and AIM, and then for the most part, the social network things were primarily things that were in its truest form social. So like, they were great. You could sort of find niches if you were queer, or for people of color, they had things like Black Planet, Asian Avenue, Mi Gente, and like those were arenas where folks could connect. And so it's for a very long time, like I internalized the idea that like social media life is like fun leisure activity that you do when you're like done with your quote unquote real life or real world, and then like you go back to like what you do in the real world. And to apply that to academic life, it was very much this idea that like social media is nothing more than just a distraction from like you doing your real work. In fact, like people for a very long time would scoff at the idea of using any sort of online data or internet data to be like the empirical evidence used to advance like a quote unquote legitimate study. So that's where things started in the early 2000s. Obviously that's changed, but I want to, before I move on, like change eras, Laura, I want to pass it over to you and see what you think.
Oh, I love that you've brought it back to like the dawn of social media, because you and I are roughly the same age. We were in college at roughly the same time. And I remember that so clearly. I'm trying to remember the exact progress of Facebook. Facebook started at Harvard, and then I believe Facebook's second, like immediate second generation migration was to the Ivies and Stanford, I believe. If anybody wants to correct me on the historical record there, I'm open to correction. And that was 2004 when I was a sophomore at Columbia. And I remember that so distinctly, like the whispers in the library of like, have you tried Facebook? Do you know this? And everybody had, like Anthony noted, done the MySpace thing, and Friendster had a little moment, but Facebook was something entirely different. And I think what's often eclipsed in the story of social media's dawn from this vantage point is how it was elitist to its core from the beginning, right? Like this started at Harvard, then its next most urgent and important iteration was to Stanford and the Ivies, and then everything else flowed from there. And I think if we're talking about the sort of geopolitics of what social media is and how we might position it within this discussion, I think that's a really important thing to hold in the frame as we sit here at Stanford University. Like it has been a vector of elitism since the beginning. And in fact, it has been a vector of elitism marketing itself as democracy since the very, very beginning.
Yeah, and there were
Back to you.
some, it's funny because in the same period that Laura was mentioning, I make my way over to the Philippines, and Philippines is a place, like any country, has a tremendous amount of economic inequality. But one thing that I did notice that sort of hinted at the idea that like social media's potential could be democratic was, folks who are in the most economically precarious position possible were like asking us, what's your Friendster? And eventually when I go back, what's your Facebook? And so once Facebook or other arenas eliminated those institutional barriers, then you really got to see evidence that like there was all sort of like injecting of new perspectives, the creation of new content, from MySpace. I mean, if anyone remembers MySpace, there's a way you could sort of design your page with like code and HTML. It's a way to sort of demonstrate your proficiency. It inspired a generation of graphic designers who in that era were able to amplify their social position by harnessing their ability to use social media in really savvy ways. And so that, I think that trend of like, and social media was very racialized as well. So like certain social networking sites were very much dominated by Black and Latinx perspectives, Asian American like users, in ways that were contradictory to the automatic assumption that like there was a digital divide that automatically boxed out people of color. And so there was a lot of stuff going on in the mid 2000s when it came to like whose space was this and whose voice counts.
This is really fascinating. Let me underline some of the aspects that you're touching upon. So there is this push to historicize, which I find very interesting, right? To historicize the question, what does it mean to be an academic online? Well, let's look back and think as to when did academics start to be online? How did it happen? The conflicting forces of the elitism on the one hand and the more or less real democratization on the other. I'm going to quote Professor Ocampo here, idea of amplifying your social position, right? What that means. Let me interject a little story also. I don't know if we are the same generation, roughly speaking. I graduated from college in the early 2000s, but in Colombia. And so when you were talking about the Philippines, Antony, I thought, yeah, that arrived a little later. And so I remember going to a room full of computers at the university that had like those black screens with the green blinking cursor. And you had to type in this whole complicated thing to go into your email. And that was phenomenal, right? I also recall consulting from a library a CD-ROM of the Philosopher's Index, which as a CD-ROM, right, allowed you to find all of these references that had been published on whatever it is that you were looking at. At the time, I was looking at Anselm of Canterbury, of all people. And I could tell because of the CD-ROM that these articles existed, and yet I had no access to those journals because there weren't subscriptions at the time, right? If you look at the place where I did my undergrad, my alma mater in Colombia, right? Of course, there's a subscription to the journals. The Philosopher's Index is a database and it's online. It's not a CD-ROM. And yet you wonder, how has this synchronization happened, if at all, right? I mean, do we still have a lag? Are we not thinking this in the right term, like the terms of modernity and reaching a certain modernity? Are we in a different temporality by virtue of the fact that we are academics online? Let me see if that question perhaps resonates for another round on that one.
This is an oblique on-ramp to answering your question, Héctor, but when I think about what does it mean to be an academic online in the year of our Lord 2021, What I know to be true is there is a 6-year-old doing first grade in the room right next to me, and that is a major concern for what it means to be an academic online this particular year. I might also note that that 6-year-old finished kindergarten in remote setting, because so we have, this is now, as with everybody here, this is now our second school year that has been completed, at least in some part, totally online. Mitch was in my last class. Mitch was the last person I saw in person, in effect, right? Like that was the last time, was week 8 of winter quarter 2020, that like classroom learning was a thing. So what does that mean? It means, oh man, there's so many things that you brought in, Professor Hoyos, but I guess I just keep thinking about how fragmented we are, how moving academia online seems to propose that it might condense things in a certain way, that we might focus all of our work at this desk where I'm going to sit for 10 hours a day, and that might sort of streamline things in a certain way. We're not commuting, we're not traveling to conferences, all of that. But we have also completely scrambled the conditions of what work is, such that there is a child in the room next to me while I am sitting here doing work. And this has vast implications for these labor conditions. So that wasn't a tremendously cogent thought, but I felt I had to think through that question a little bit literally through the lens of where I'm sitting right now and how bananas that is and still is. Anthony, I take it to you.
Yeah, and I think about the labor conditions that don't apply when your intellectual production ends up circulating as a commodity that students pay tuition for years after you've passed away. And so I can't get over the example from the university where, with the assistance of someone just like doing the typical bureaucracy of grades and such, you could viably have a professor record a class and it's used in perpetuity, which is like the most, like, this is the thing about tech. I think with a lot of like tech, there is a lot of innovation without the sort of questions of conscience of what this can bring. I feel like that's the theme that resonates in every single documentary I've watched about tech, is that there's a rush to create innovation without questioning what are the implications 10, 20, 30 years from now, when all of this, can morph into things we didn't even imagine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So yeah, on the one hand, like I think about that's one bookend of what it's like to be an academic online. But I think about, like, as you were talking about the intro, and sharing like some of the findings from the book, I also think about the other end of the bookend, which is that my dissertation and first book stemmed from a 3-page essay that some grad student at Berkeley posted on their blog on like Angel Fire, and how there was one sentence in that stood out to me that ended up spawning my entire undergraduate and graduate careers, like research, pathway for research, and how that in and of itself, because the way that academia is structured, because of the particular research interests I had in Filipino Americans, the inability for me to access any sort of intellectual experience at my institution of higher ed around the topic I wanted to study, the internet became, like, by virtue of my constraints, became the pathway to like intellectual, like my ideas coming into fruition intellectually. So it's like it's a double-edged sword to the max.
Yeah. So I like, where this is headed. And again, I'm going to underline things here. Laura, you talked about fragmentation, and you used that that metaphor also that it's quite interesting. The first event we had in this series, in this remote series in MTL, was a conversation with Jonathan Beller, who is famous for coining the phrase the cinematic mode of production, and for thinking in the late 90s, mind you, what the attention economy is. And we are in the midst of rewriting the attention economy. It's crazy. And by that, I mean, I cannot wrap my mind around it now. or yet, but as we strive to engage in intellectual conversation here by, by way of a screen, there might be a chat coming my way from Nancy inquiring, are we going to record this? This is not the case, Nancy, but that could happen. Or I might get a notification of someone else who has joined the room. And when you are, I'm thinking of Jameson's cognitive mapping, right? And sometimes when you are in a situation you don't understand, your first step is to see a conspiracy. So if I were paranoid, following that methodology, I'd say they're conspiring to drench the attention from me. I don't know who they is, right? And I could easily be getting carried away, but there's something here. There's some kernel of truth to what is happening to us, and it might be connected, as Antony drew the connection to labor, right? This new avatar of intellectual labor that is also attention labor. The demands of constantly switching. I don't know, perhaps Antony, if you'd like to add there.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about what you said. I think, I was just listening to a story about when YouTube as a streaming platform switched from their metric of success being clicks and metrics of success being, they transformed it to viewing time. And so that one engineering tweak has prompted a tremendous shift in the way that content is disseminated and content is digested, because in order to maximize watch time, they just had to sort of crank out video after video after video that ends up being like recommended because of an algorithm. And so I think about what that does in like everyday life. And here I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that like my friend Forrest Stewart here wrote a book called Ballad of the Bullet, in which, there's a really interesting case with drill music that started in the city in South Chicago, where in the absence of economic capital, attention capital, it becomes the most symbolic, important form of currency in particular contexts. And so what ends up happening is that Black, mostly men in the South part of Chicago, end up producing drill videos, which end up sort of amplifying their presence, their social status, their like count. And that's something that gets disseminated, and then you have this like culture of micro celebrity, which is, the idea that you have visibility doesn't necessarily translate to, economic viability. So yeah, I think there's a lot going on. And I do think that in some ways, like whether we're talking about right-wing YouTubers that have tens of millions of subscribers, or we're talking about drill music from Chicago, I do think that academics fit squarely, like they're doing the exact same thing in whatever ways. There's emerged this culture within Twitter spheres or Facebook to some extent, where there's certain ways of being and there's a certain way of enacting one's professional identity that carries a lot of traction, but can also harm you depending on things like your social location as a Black woman or a trans person. So it's in ways that I would not have imagined. Online life, professional life, and quote unquote real life are now if they're a Venn diagram, they're a perfect circle, which is just bananas to me too. So
I guess one question to ask is, at what point are academics part of the problem or part of the solution, right? With this idea of the culture of micro celebrity. Okay, let me pause there and maybe shift. So we'll be talking about the big picture, right? The contradiction in terms of trying to do thoughtful scholarship by using platforms that we know are also using us, right? The fundamental contradiction there. We also wanted to think about 2021 in light of the social media erosion that um, the former office of the president promoted in the US, and one has to say by extension in the rest of the world. There's a growth of social media under Trump and thanks to Trump as a force within cyberspace, right? And also a reckoning and a collapse. And of course, you have the January 6th siege. So, just out of curiosity, and by all means, we're asking a lot of our speakers today, but I'm just curious, how do you see things changing in light of the present conjuncture? Laura, you're muted.
That's a good point. Maybe just unmute. I think that social media and Twitter in particular, which is my primary entry point to social media in my current life, will and are absolutely counted among the institutions which have lost trust as a result of the political turmoil of the last 4 years, to put it very generously. I'm pausing so I don't just get sucked back into the narcissistic vortex of the last 4 years. How do I see it changing? I don't know if I see it changing. And also, to your previous implied question, I think that academics and academia are absolutely part of the problem of micro-celebrity. And not to put you on the spot, Héctor, because you are obviously obeying the convention here, but we opened this talk with our author bios, which are, in essence, as I teach in my pitching and publishing class, a performance of cultural capital. So we are all right now in this discussion participating in a culture of micro-celebrity that reinforces all of the paradigms that we are also challenging. And I include myself within that, like I am part of the problem. It's my fault. So I absolutely think we're in a hall of mirrors here, and that the earth is dying while we fumble our way out. And now I'm going to pass the baton to Professor Ocampo and ask him to make some sense of that.
Yeah, I reckon with how internet is being weaponized in ways unlike any other previous time before. We had cyberbullying, and we had, luckily, the first lady had her Be Best campaign that was so effective. Sorry, but we had like cyberbullying, and that we have. I'm old enough to remember that time when that Rutgers student, because this Rutgers student was gay, they posted a video of that person having a same-sex interaction, led to that person's taking their own life. And so I'm aware that that's an example of how the internet could be weaponized. That was sort of an earlier iteration of what's going on today. But I just think it's so different, in the same way that white supremacist ideologies can garner more and more support in a way that is incredibly efficient compared to when we didn't have social media. I have moments where I'm just sitting on my couch and I just don't know how to move, because the rate at which disinformation can be churned out is nowhere near the rate that accurate information can be churned out. And so what do we make of that? On the flip side, I think about how, if by participating in micro celebrity, and I'm super guilty of this, and it's part of the reason I usually take a January fast off all social media, just to realize that I still exist without my manufactured self. The truth of the matter is that so many of my career opportunities happen by social media, and so many of the folks that I've been able to reach with an academic book from Stanford University Press is by and large by social media. So if I get an email from a high schooler that's doing is it a zine or a zine? Magazine? A high schooler doing a zine or a a senior thesis. Like I've gotten emails from high school kids that are like, I wrote my senior thesis based off your book, you know, or college students that do documentaries based off that. And so I don't think that would have happened without the micro celebrity. And I'm very being from LA, I was very conscious of how celebrity can be utilized in a way that can wield positive impact. I wasn't sort of thinking about the ways in which it like damages your mental health at the time, but for the sake of, in the same way that that person's blog reached me, I know that like putting my book out there and putting my work out there provides opportunities for some student or youth that I'll never meet in my life to reimagine the world in some different way. But it goes like for the worst of humanity and the best of humanity.
The book contracts for a little while now have this provision that the author sometimes has to engage in social media, or they ask you, what social media are you on? And it is also expected of the author to be promoting their work. It's you're not just the author, you're also the chief promoter, or the promoter in chief.
Mm-hmm.
And this phrase that you used earlier, Laura, about the performance of cultural capital, the bio as a performance of cultural capital, I wonder how to think about this from the perspective of our graduate students. And if anyone wants to chip in, by all means, we're all here listening to each other. If someone has an established career, is recognized in an institution, in the public sphere, then that's when it's more tempting to critique such performances of cultural capitals. Once you already have them. But what happens if you don't have them, right? If you have to establish yourself, or you want to establish yourself, are there more ethical ways of doing it? Are there ways in which you won't get lost in the attempt of having this alternate persona, your online person, Anthony, as you were putting it earlier? We can maybe return to other questions, but I wonder if off the top of your head, there's any suggestions about how to, if you are going to build such a persona, or you are going to circulate in social media and in the online world, and now we don't have an option, that's just the only outlet. Are there more ethical ways of doing it, or better ways in any sense?
Yeah, I feel like that falls pretty squarely in my wheelhouse. I want to try to connect what I'm thinking about that question to what I was thinking about what Anthony just said. And I think they are related, because if the author bio is an accumulation of cultural capital, it is the sort of what of a writer's career. What have you done? How can it be substantiated? It is not a why of a writer's career. And I think that's where the ethical center is located, is the why of a writer's career. And this doesn't quite speak to the practical concern of your question, Héctor, which is how can grad students build a effective bio before they have garnered the cultural capital of people who are professional academics? Like, that's a germane question that I cover in my pitching and publishing class, and you all can sign up for that. But what I was going to say is I think the why of a writer's career is much more important and tends to flow more inevitably into the what than chasing Twitter followers does. And one thing that I'm thinking of when I say that is the student whose name you were trying to remember, Anthony, is Tyler Clementi. And I remember that vividly. For two reasons. One, because the epidemic of suicide among queer and trans youth was absolutely part of the origin story of me as a writer too. That led very directly to the publication of my first novel, which was a lesbian love story. That novel was roughly the reason I wrote that novel is because I read a newspaper story in 2007 or 8 about a high school 20 minutes from where I had grown up in Minnesota, where 19 queer students had died by suicide in the same school year. And it was because I had no trouble imagining the desperate circumstances that those students were trying to survive in daily life that I felt like I had to speak in a book length way towards what I understood about those concerns. And the other reason why Tyler Clementi is such an interesting and I think fruitful kind of node to bring into this conversation is because he also gave rise to one of the people who I think is one of the most fascinating avatars of social media, which is Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky is a brilliant public speaker, and I highly recommend her TED Talk, The Price of Shame, in which she talks about how she had basically compartmentalized the trauma of the hearings and everything that happened in 1998 until Tyler Clementi's suicide. And until she heard that story, she had like a huge sort of post-traumatic trigger meltdown that forced her to bring herself back into public life. And she is now like the kindest person on Twitter, who is like so consistently classy and interesting. And I just find that to be a fascinating transformation. She positions herself as patient zero of the internet's culture of humiliation. And I think that's a very interesting contention. So Tyler Clementi invokes a lot of things that I think are pretty relevant to the ethical center of this discussion, to my mind.
Yeah, I think that I think about this a lot in terms of my responsibility. I feel like I was a grad student yesterday. I mean, it's been a decade, but like it feels like, oh, literally, shoot, it's been a decade. But I feel like I was a grad student yesterday. And when grad students are very much in moments of infantilization and feeling less than and rejected are quite commonplace. And I have this one Forrest and I have this wonderful friend named Elena Xie, who's a professor at Brown in American Studies, where there's like this photo montage on Facebook where we're at the corner of Westwood and Westwood Boulevard. Like we're UCLA in Westwood Village, and we're trying to buy El Pollo Loco, and like we go to my bank, and I can't, like, I have no money, and I can't pull, like, my balance is -$2 and my other balance is $0. And so that's the memory that is still very much etched in my persona. And then 10 years passes by, and all of a sudden, like, you're a professor that's written a book that has tenure, and you forget, like, that comes with some responsibility. This is all to say, like, earlier this morning, I tweeted about bidets, the like water thing that cleans your bum when you use the bathroom. And I think that, like, if I was a grad student, it would be a mistake to be like, oh, let me tweet about bidets, because I think the implications of what, like, the spectrum of freedom that professors have versus grad students is very different, because the implications of what the job hire, like the academic job market, is like for you compared to me, which is I'm not applying for a job. So that's a long-winded way of saying, like, I don't think it's good to police people on Twitter, but I do think that what folks write lands differently based on your positionality. As what I have witnessed from graduate students that I am just in complete awe of is their ability to cultivate communities that reach across the globe, whether that is around activism that doesn't have the space to get exercise in a grad department, whether that's, my partner's a biochemist master's student, and so he's Filipino, he's queer, he's never gonna run into another Filipino. He's never going to run into a queer POC scientist. Like, chances are, like, 99 times out of 100, he's never going to run into someone. On Twitter, he's able to have a thriving community of 30 or 40 queer Filipino American scientists across the disciplines that he can now go to in the same way we would think we used to go to our dissertation advisor or dissertation committee. And so I think that the savvy and robust communities that grad students have formed around hashtags, whether it's like Black in STEM or, social Twitter, whatever the case may be, I think that they provide a lot of function for making it to the finish line and understanding how to navigate a continuingly terrible job market, both in and out of academia. That is one thing I'll add too, is that folks that have gone to non-academic jobs have been extremely generous with sharing resources and other tips for how to navigate alternative ways of finding careers.
At some point when we were preparing our meeting today, we talked about maybe showing some examples of either screenshots or Twitter accounts that you follow. And I know that you have a very rich archive. So Laura, would you take it away?
I would be happy to. I saw a tweet recently that was like, can professors stop saying I'm about to share my screen, but I'm about to share my screen. Oh God, what am I about to share? Can you guys, no? Oh God. Share Keynote, there we go. I don't know if Zoom's gonna allow me to share my screen. That might not work. Hold on just a second. Anthony, why don't you take it away while I do a little troubleshooting over here, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, let me pull up like just let me pull up I'm like over prepared always, but all right. So I think Twitter's a salon. Like at a conference, if you go to the hotel lobby, you probably just can't like talk to every single person there. I think it's good to get a sense of the landscape, and it's good to get a sense of like who you want to be in conversation with. So I just like have this rinky-dink Venn diagram, because for me, like when you're in grad school, you're so focused on your topic, and you think that like at least I used to think that's the only thing I'm capable of speaking of. And then I had to broaden my ideas. So for me, like it's been important, like my mission is to be in conversation with students and scholars, now writers of immigration and race, everyday Filipinos, from like my aunties to people in the Philippines, to Filipino American college students. And I don't remember, like, when I say know nothings, this is like folks that are interested in the topics of immigration and race, or interested in Filipino Americans, but like literally have no starting point and they're just curious. So when I think about all the things I post either on Facebook or Twitter, it always most likely fits one of these categories. And more recently, I've done higher ed. So on like Facebook, this is where I think Facebook's really good for like announcements, sharing articles, promoting other authors. I didn't want like Facebook to be this annoying thing where I was just promoting like my work, but I think most people here are interested about Twitter. And so for me, I've organically discovered that my Twitter falls into a couple categories. I'll do like higher ed Twitter. So this is the tweet that I think probably got the most traction in my life ever, which is just talking about my students. And I work at CalPoly. It's a very different segment of the college student population than Stanford. Mostly first gen, mostly students of color, mostly like a lot of parents, a lot of folks that work full time. And in the larger conversations about higher ed and students, it was very obvious when you work at a campus like this that the perspectives of students who have real lives, I'm sorry, that's really condescending. The perspective of students who work 40 hours a week and also are parenting or caregiving, that's very different than a student that is on like say work study or has the privilege to focus on school solely. So anyway, I wanted to like inject their perspective into the convo. So with their permission, I shared I did a Google survey and I shared some of their experiences during pandemic. This ended up being super useful. If you click on the impressions, it reached like 5.3 million people. But it's really simple stuff. Like last week, I wanted people to know what my students are going through. And what was nice about this is like faculty reached out and said, I'm changing my syllabus because I saw this tweet, which is like very cool to hear. So another higher ed tweet, just, certain things that ever I can't ever say in like to the provost, I'll say on Twitter sometimes. I'm not a fan of SAT or GRE. I think it's worth saying out loud. So that's another one. But of course, like it's not I don't think it's beneficial to keep your Twitter profile to be solely about your labor, because I think that ends up, it doesn't endear you to an audience. And I think it's important to selectively, without pimping, like without disclosing everything about your personal life, it's important to give some semblance of who you are. Twitter, I think it's necessary to have some sense of humanity on there, or it just doesn't work very well. So for me, a large audience of mine is Filipino, so I just found some silly TikTok that said, Siri, do Filipinos celebrate Christmas? And it was some Filipinos that were dancing very excitedly to Jingle Bell Rock or something. And with the Filipino thing, we often talk about our intergenerational stuff. So this is my parents. I bought a jacket for my mom for her birthday, but because of pandemic, I can't return, like I can't try things on. So I had to buy two. And my dad ended up taking my mom's second jacket. So that sort of stuff, I think, is an example of what helps. And I think for me, most recently, because I'm in a position of privilege, mental health has been an important thing to be very open about. Vulnerability, because I know that folks with privilege, there's no consequence to me if I share my vulnerability. And so, my big thing is anxiety and the relationship of anxiety and achievement. So I often tweet things related to that topic, just to form community, and sometimes I'm just having a bad day and I need to feel okay, and writing those things makes me feel less alone during pandemic. So
thank you, Anthony. And I like the community building aspect of what you just shared, right? It's not just pro forma. And the distinction might be subtle, given that you're always sharing and liking, but there's ways of doing that and ways, right? Laura.
We're going to give this another shot. So let me pull this up. Let me pull this up. We're going to share screen. It's going to be the keynote and share.
yay.
All right. Yay. Okay. So that's not the beginning. This is the beginning. Play. Okay, the twist course. So I, at this point, really only engage with Twitter. I have a profile on Facebook that is not at all active. Up until probably about 2017 or 2018, was still posting articles on Facebook when they would get published, just sort of to, do the pro forma thing. I'm over it. I don't do Facebook that much anymore. I also, as previously mentioned, have children and have some pretty serious privacy concerns about sharing pictures of my minor children without their consent to people unknown. So those are some feelings I have. I also just want to note that I used my terminal degree here, which I almost never do, but I used it because of the whole Dr. Jill Biden thing, and because I think my MFA is relevant to this. I don't think I would have ever ended up at Stanford without the internet, and I think my presence as an internet-based writer, it really has contributed to that. So here's who I am on Twitter. You can follow me if you want. You will notice a big difference in the numbers on my Twitter and the numbers on Anthony's Twitter. He has many more followers than I do. And I'm so happy having just kind of a medium-sized amount of followers on Twitter. Like, I don't get the trolls. I don't get the Nazis as much. I mean, sometimes they roll in, but like, I'm kind of fine just like cruising in this mid-zone. If I were teaching this in my pitching and publishing class, I might note that I have indicated a few places where you can find more of my work on my profile. I have definitely used the @Stanford as a performance of my cultural capital, and I have noted my personal website, my podcast, and my newsletter are all ways of further engaging with my work. I have also noted that I love the movie Drop Dead Gorgeous. You see Allison Janney and Ellen Barkin up there, and that is an iconic film. Okay, so let's see. So the twist course is purposeful pedagogy. Like sometimes there's a way to kind of thread the needle of performing not just cultural capital, but performing your career and also like making an ethical point, right? So last night, I just happened to see this tweet where this woman I don't know said during my MFA, sometimes I'd ask about business stuff and people would tell me I should only focus on writing. And the rage just rose in me afresh, you know, and I remembered why, you know, this burning passion inspired me to start teaching business and pitching concerns to writers. And it's so convenient when people on Twitter just make your point for you, you know? So I was really pleased to seize that opportunity for engagement. And there's the rest of the thread. And just to sort of like elaborate upon the points that I was making, I do think it's unconscionable to ask any students to pay for a degree and then not to train them with any skills towards a job market. You know, like capitalism is definitely the elephant in the room here, and it sucks, but we all have to make a living. And as I say in this tweet, like, the idea that we can send students out of these programs without any of these trainings is just flat old classist and racist. And if I had another 10 tweets, I would tell you about how it's sexist too. So another way that I kind of engage with the twist course is just like, how do I share knowledge? You know, like, what do I love about teaching? What pieces of information do I give to my Stanford students within this very elite microcosm that might also be of use to people beyond just the Stanford universe? So I gave this like woo-woo little tip about my writing costume. My writing costume is sitting on my bed right now. It's an alpaca wool poncho and I love it. And then my poet friend Maria made like a really good point that perfume is also like a positive sensory association you can make with your writing time. So I offer this tip now all to you. Here's another one. So this kind of combines what those two purposes are. How do I share knowledge beyond just the ivory tower? And like, why do I do what I do? What am I here for? What is the ethical and professional purpose of that? And one thing that I've found, and Antony, I know, is someone who's really passionate about inclusivity and how it applies to language. And I found this funny thing that if I just changed the designation of office hours to student hours, the students actually showed up. And it was this incredible thing. And I realized that it was, as you'll see in this next tweet, like, well, sort of, it's the students who assume that they don't belong at Stanford, who would conflate office hours with like Professor Goode's writing time where she's doing her writing and research, I better not interrupt her, to this is time that Laura has set aside specifically to talk to students, which brings her joy, you know? So that's just a way that I sort of narrate my process as a teacher, just sort of make that more transparent beyond just Stanford. As Antony also touched on this, you know, writing sucks. It's horrible. It's hard. It takes a lot of time and you have to sit alone to do it, you know? So sometimes I'm just sort of like in medias res commenting on what's going on in my writing brain. And Zadie Smith spent 2 years writing a paragraph. I mean, is that the most stone cold thing you've ever heard? Like, that is confidence, by the way. I always bring up Zadie Smith when we talk about author bios in pitching and publishing, because I have noticed on her last 3 book jackets, Zadie Smith's author bio is Zadie Smith lives in London. Now that is like a drop the mic performance of cultural capital, because what she's saying is, you motherfuckers all know me and I don't need to perform what my publications and my credentials are. So anyway, that's an interesting point for grad students too. Sometimes you can just drop the mic and say Zadie Smith did it first. This is another sort of writing process. The twist course's public notebook. You know, I was like rewatching Sex and the City and I was like, in every single show about 4 white girls, no matter how old they are, there's a sexy one, there's a neurotic one, there's a kind of dumb, naive one, and then there's a 4th. And I was like, are they just the same? Are these the same women at different? Anyway, I'm in the process of pitching this to Vulture. That's true. Oops. How did this happen? So another way to use Twitter is, especially if you are someone with the platform, and like Antony was saying, if you are someone who's considering the privilege of being a professor or being someone with a platform, you might think about who you're going to amplify and to what end. And this is one thing that I chose to amplify recently because I thought it was a really well-made point. So those are some ways that I use Twitter. They are certainly not the only ways. Thank you for coming to my PowerPoint.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those. So it seems that going over 10,000 followers is a liability, Anthony, you were saying?
Yeah, you know, I've heard that from other writer friends that life is okay around 8K. And then once you start to get to 12 and up, it gets a little, you have to expend more energy managing.
I see. Okay, I am very ignorant about these matters. Wait, I have one last question for you, and then maybe we'll open it up. I'm sure our participants have lots of questions. And this is a self-serving question, but the self here is the MTL community. The question is, what recommendations would you have for a program dear to your heart, Antony? I know, like Modern Thought and Literature, who has a nice website, but is also in the process of revamping that website. And Nancy and Amy are going to be thinking about this. And so your guidance would be much appreciated, of course, not just in terms of the website, but the whole problem of the online presence of an academic program.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the usual sort of postings that departments are used to, which is events or events promoting particular like alumni, sharing us like an extended article about it, even doing extended articles about stuff related to it is gonna be the bare minimum, but it's not gonna do anything for you. I think that what as a Twitter, it's important to think about how you can tap into the zeitgeist and which zeitgeists you're trying to go for. So I imagine for MTL, there's ethnic studies Twitter, there's literary Twitter, there's publishing Twitter, there's academia Twitter, obviously like elite university like university Twitter. There's a whole bunch of Twitter like forums that aren't officially forums in the same way like AOL chat rooms are. And I think with enough chit chatting, it's easy to figure out that stuff. I do think that folks need to be okay experimenting and get their feet wet. And so for when I didn't know how to use Twitter, my friend Nancy Yen, who's a Asian American public intellectual, she says, well, the first step is just to figure out who you're gonna like. For me, I was like, who am I gonna fangirl over or whatever, and follow them and just get a sense of what the conversations are like. So just to give you a concrete example, I picked up the book Bad Feminist in 2014 or 2015. I absolutely adored it. I started following Roxanne on Twitter and just sort of learned who her friends were, who like what people she communicated with, occasionally participated, but not in a way that was overbearing. And eventually, like if I see Roxanne Gay at an event, she'll say, "Hi, Anthony." And she has a podcast and she's like, she'll see something I wrote and she invited me to be on her podcast. So it's like super organic. There's organic ways to connect with folks. So I guess concretely for MTL, I'd imagine what cool people do you want to be in convo with? And I think like a first step would be start following the public intellectuals and writers that are just cool people. So Imani Perry at Princeton, Eddie Glaude at Princeton. They're very great. They're very savvy at the public stuff. Jelani Cobb. There's who am I missing, Laura? There's like a whole slew of amazing folks that know how to straddle all the things.
Certainly Tressie.
Cottom.
Yeah. Gia. Basically everyone who I've ever invited to speak at Stanford, follow them on Twitter.
Alexander Chi. That's the last one. So
Anthony. I was just going to say, I don't think Roxanne Gay's importance or centrality to Twitter discourse can be overstated. Like there was a before Roxanne Gay and an after Roxanne Gay with Twitter in the circles that we're describing here. Héctor, I have to answer your question with my film producer hat on and not my professor hat on, because your question makes me think in very procedural terms. Were I you, here's what I would do. Take or leave what's useful to you. I would pay 3 to 4 grad students to admin your Twitter account. I wouldn't hand the keys over to a single person because I think MTL is founded on the premise of a diversity of perspectives. I would pay those graduate students a moderate amount because tweeting is labor. and this is going to take time. I would pay them initially, I would make their first task to follow everyone Antony just mentioned, probably follow everyone Antony follows, probably follow everyone I follow, and also follow every single MTL alum you can locate in the Twitter sphere. I'm seeing smiles, and I am not kidding about this. Really engage deeply within the Stanford sphere, right? Follow everyone you can think of who is connected to Stanford, because those people are going to follow you back, a lot of them. Then I would do what Antony suggested. I would start promoting events. I would start promoting recent publications. I would heavily promote any publications by grad students. I don't know if you guys know that Mitch predicted the entire pod craze of 2020, 2021. I would start by promoting Mitch's article. And I would continue with a steady flow of internal promotions and retweets of associated causes, and keep the engagement steady and consistent until it grows, and make sure that this is a position that is handed over smoothly year over year as folks graduate. But I would give the Twitter keys to 3 to 4 digital native tech literate grad students and pay them to maintain them. That's what I would do.
Thank you, thank you. This is what we were looking for. Much appreciated. Obviously, handing the keys would entail things like, if you're speaking in the voice of an academic program, you cannot, I don't know, weigh in on electoral politics in the same way, at least, that you would as a private person. I mean, there would have to be a conversation among us as to the criteria, but that certainly sounds like a good idea, and I'd be curious to hear from grad students if they're interested, because maybe we even get traction on that front.
They do tend to be interested in paid opportunity. It's been my experience that grad students are very interested in paid opportunities.
And revisiting, that question from earlier on. So someone was, joking that every time that someone posts something on Twitter, the rent prices on the Bay Area go higher by like 1/10 of a cent or something. Every tweet is like, connected to rent prices and real estate.
We're so fucked. Yeah.
So, I mean, is there a problem of, you mentioned, Antony, not being like overbearing, but how about overdoing? I mean, I hear, I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here, right? I hear something like a gospel of growth in what you're saying. So more is more content, more connection, more, right? I worry, right? Because this we've heard about other forms of capitalism and of extractivism. Maybe it's not predicated on people's attention spans back in the day, but now that it is there a limit? I mean, is there such a thing as overdoing it?
Yeah, I think that if be careful to share work, because people will steal. That's super important. And it's like, that's really bad. I think that I wouldn't be afraid to put out content, because when you start, no one's gonna like your unless you're like, once a day is not enough. So I'm talking like, I'll be sitting I'll be laying in bed, and before I get up, I'll send out 5 tweets. It's like not a thing, because you got to really see what works. Like it's you won't know what your steez is until you hit your, you won't know until you hit your stride. And I think that that's something that applies with writers, is that in the same way with your writing, you have to find your voice. With Twitter, you have to find your voice as well, in addition to like following folks. I think that if you don't develop a distinctive voice and you can't compete in the marketplace of ideas, then Twitter, you won't be useful as like a disseminator of content. But for the grad students, I think you don't need to do that. You can just use it as a community building tool. So it's yeah, I think what would be like egregious to you, like you personally, Héctor, to like tweet in one day, like number wise?
Well, I'm not sure that I know number wise, frankly, Antony, because I am, not on Twitter. I'm very analog. I wouldn't say I'm a neo-Luddite, but every now and then I do flirt with that. And I taught a class at Stanford through STS a number of times called The Critique of Technology. And And I worry about the devaluation of language, okay? Because language, if you think of, Baudrillard and the political economy of the sign, is something not just valuable or precious, but something that can devalue, and as a result, whatever you say is gibberish, right? So there is a value also to I don't know, Beckett's poetry. The 3 lines. You could tweet a full-on poem by Beckett, but it is part of that very tense and limited economy that makes it powerful. I also worry about the way we're using content, because content is a metaphor, and its counterpart is form, which we tend to compromise with. So we are given 140 or however many characters it is now on Twitter, and that is what people don't compromise on. We're also, making people rich by selling advertising, and that happens to academics as well. So I do have to say that I ask myself, as a private person, not as MTL director, but as a private person, the question of whether it's better to promote more analog ways of building community, even now that we seem to be like caught in the screen. Like now it's screen time for everyone. This maybe is a moot discussion, unless we were to like send each other letters, which I don't know why we couldn't, but anyways. I do want to open it for questions also, because I know that people have different views and different expectations as to what the digital imprimatur of a program would be like. So I wonder if maybe Mitch, you'd like to tell us about the experience that Laura was mentioning, or Ali, if you'd like to voice perhaps some concerns. The floor is open for anyone who'd like to weigh in. And thank you again to our speakers.
I have a quick question, if that's okay. As an MTL student who is in my 6th year and hopefully defending my dissertation in May, and who's used Twitter mostly as a way to kind of like follow academics and just kind of like look from the outside in, and uses it also to just, less now, but to like vent, politically. What are the pragmatic do's and don'ts as a person in my situation, kind of structural situation, who might be trying to stick around academia for a while, to not, and I try to be very kind and like respectful on Twitter, but nonetheless, like, what are the academic do's and don'ts that someone is going to look at in a job committee and say, everything else looks great, but this one tweet is, canceled. So what should one keep in mind? Or am I overthinking this, that I should be like, stepping on twinkle toes?
You're not overthinking it. You're absolutely right. I think absolute don'ts. I think maybe this is just more my personality, but I don't engage in a takedown that I'm not willing to have in person. Does that make sense? Because I do get, that's just more of a personal thing of like, I don't want to exercise a particular type of courage where I'm not forced to like follow through with the critique that I make. That's just a personal decision. And I do think that while I think it's important for us to hear grad student perspectives about exploitative labor practices, you saw what happened, the importance of it with UC Santa Cruz, for example, or with UC students. I do think that it's a delicate dance of being mindful about about what might compromise your job situation and what won't. There's a piece by Saida Grundy in Ethnic and Racial Studies that lays out what it was like for her to encounter abuse on Twitter and how that she navigated that, based on very things that landed the wrong way with a particular segment of users that happened to, I think, write to the school she worked at. And so, Laura, what's our do's and don'ts? It changes all the time.
Well, some of it changes all the time and some of it is truly evergreen. You know, Juan, I think you already touched on one of the things that I think is most important, which is just like basic kindness. And like, it seems pedantic to elaborate on this, but yet there's such a dearth of it on Twitter so much of the time. I mean, the way I would elaborate upon basic kindness is like, don't ever punch down, you know, like don't ever shit on someone who, whatever, it's just dumb. What Anthony said, like I would not pick a fight that I wouldn't pick in person at a dinner party. I don't really fight on Twitter. And I do think that some of this is self-protectiveness as a woman, and as a woman with children. But I just tend to find that I am like a happier person when I'm not just dwelling in the vitriol part of like both my brain and the Twitter brain. So I've made that into an intentional choice that Twitter is a place where I uplift the things that I want to celebrate. You know, like I am going to amplify the things I want to bring more attention to rather than trying to get the wittiest comment on the things that I hate. And there is, you certainly won't hear me shitting on cancel culture, but there is a game that takes place about sort of who can find the flaw in the tweet first sometimes. And it's not a good faith argument, you know, and I just think bringing as much good faith as possible to that public presence is probably great for your professional prospects and also like good for your soul. So that is one basic rule of engagement I suggest. And like, I think that Anthony is much better qualified to give you advice on the job market than I am because my path is extremely non-traditional, semicolon, however, comma. I have never had a conversation in a job interview about my social media presence. That could be because my social media presence is unobjectionable, and it could be because nobody had time to review it. I don't know. I will never know. But I'll add that to the store of anecdotal knowledge here too.
I really appreciate your mentioning not dwelling in the vitriol, because that there's a whole other dimension that we haven't talked about, which is the affect of the internet since 2016 to 2020, right? The pent up anger that you also sometimes see in academics when they're rebuking someone else's book. You're like, really? Are you that angry about that reading of Hofsmannsthal or whomever? I think we had Mitch and was it Alberto next?
No, I don't have a question right now.
I'm happy to go. This is kind of I don't know, this isn't a pragmatic question directly, but I'm just kind of curious to get both of your take on a particular dimension of an issue that both of you have already touched on a little bit. And before I ask, I should just say again, just thank you so much for just this super illuminating conversation. This is such a crucial issue. So I'm thinking more about this issue of like how one as a grad student or as an emerging writer or just like as a person who's trying to make their way in the social media sphere, but doesn't have a lot of cultural capital, how one tries to build oneself and tries to accrue or create somehow that capital for themselves. And I'm wondering what you think about this, because like, it seems to me that one way that people in the circles of Twitter that I'm on, which is, I would say, literary criticism Twitter and like critical theory head Twitter, perhaps. One way that I've seen people try to negotiate this is maybe characterological, you could say, where it seems like there's like this kind of set of archetypes, like types of Twitter persona that you could be. You could be the person who's ironically self-absorbed. You could be the person who is a little bit more self-deprecating. All of these characters are kind of noted by different typing styles and frequencies of tweeting and stuff. And it seems like that characterological thing is one way of making oneself legible, even if it's just in the narrow context of one of those communities. And then that, along with that legibility, you get some sort of insider or at least non-outsider status. And I'm wondering just kind of what y'all think about the characterological or type embodying type pressures that people feel, especially when trying to make their way in social media, and kind of like how, I don't know, I've also thoughts about how one navigates that kind of stuff. It's a diffuse question, but I'd be really curious.
Yeah, I'm a sociologist, and when I was getting my PhD in sociology, I said that I wanted to study Filipino Americans, which essentially is like saying I wanted to study people smelling carpet on Fridays, So like like the same level of interest navigating the world of sociology would apply for either case. And so I'm exaggerating, of course, but my experience was as a graduate student, I noticed that people cared about me and then people cared about my research. And that's always been the sequence of events for me, is that when people got invested in me as a person, then all of a sudden they started to care about Filipinos. And so I was like, that's just the way it is. And I think that I don't want to call it a strategy, but that just way of maneuvering academia has continued on in Twitter, whether I realize it or not.
That's well said. Antony prefaced his answer with like, I'm a sociologist. So I'll preface my answer with like, I'm a novelist. So I think about character all the time, right? And I am very aware that I am performing a character on Twitter. I don't want that character to be so distant from me that she is unrecognizable. But, as you saw in the first PowerPoint of my time here at Stanford, I tweet about teaching. I tweet about writing. You can see in my bio that I am a teacher and a writer. Like I am giving you the headline of who I am, and then I am performing the script of who that person is. Now, that person is basically me, like she is recognizable to me. However, I'm always self-censoring on Twitter. Like there are a million things that I would say to my husband, to my best friend, to Anthony that I would never say on Twitter. And what I love for those are the DMs, like we haven't even gotten into private Twitter, but I have some of the spiciest conversations of not in a sexy way, but like some of the gossipiest conversations of my career in Twitter DM. Like this is the constant. This is referring back to what you were talking about earlier, Héctor, but there's this like multivalent quality to all communication right now. And there has been for some time. And one of those valences is, the public script and then the private script, and different iterations of each of those scripts too. So I'm very aware that I'm performing a character. I want people to think that that character is kind and funny and engaged and cares about something greater than herself. And if the worst thing anybody can say about that character is that she knows she's a character, then like, well, here we are in MTL, Let's go to our Bolaño expert, Yeah.
I have learned to treat every written communication as if it could potentially go public one day, though.
That's also true. Yes.
So
even in the DMs, yes.
Even in the text message, email, everything, like I just assume it's public knowledge.
Yeah.
Because one day I could 20 years from now, some researcher could be like, I want to archive his life, and I don't know I want to look at an archive of his life, and I could never know what the rules will be then, and so but yeah, that makes it hard because if you don't have a husband or someone that you can or a friend that you can just be yourself with, it gets hard. Like Laura, I try to make my online persona a logical extension of who I am, but I don't talk about race and sexuality 24/7 a day, especially when I'm with people whose race and sexuality aligns with mine. I talk about Schitt's Creek or I don't know, my dog, or I can't even think right now because I'm so anchored to the Twitter sphere of what I'm in. Sometimes when I'm really into it, I have a hard time getting in touch with what I actually like to do. And that's bad, I think, because That shows how tethered I am. I think about that scene from Wall-E where all the human beings are sitting in the recliners and their only social interaction is pressing their devices. And I'm like, that is me at least a couple hours of the day. So, but yeah, that's a great question about the character though.
And it's interesting to hear that element of alienation. Very, very interesting. Ali, you had a question.
Yeah, first, thanks so much to our speakers. I really appreciated your reflections. And I think I'm in like a good space for this question, because I think that we all can agree that, it's possible to acknowledge the benefits, for lack of a better word, of what the internet and these social media has provided us, while also acknowledging that there are like very disturbing and destructive forces going on at the same time. So that being said, I'm inside that middle space, wondering, or evoking a similar concern to Hector's. That is, there are so few spheres in which we can escape now from like a relentless quantification of value, and a relentless kind of reification of work, I suppose, and thought. And if there is like still a sphere where those things are protected, I think it ought to be the sphere of the university. And so what I've been thinking about myself first is how it could be possible for the university to maintain at least some of the integrity of that sphere. If not, I don't think it's possible to do all of it, at least not how universities function now, but yeah, at least some of that integrity. And then two, as an intellectual, it doesn't matter what sort of outlets I'm published in, or the sorts of names of magazines that feature my work. What matters ought to be, the ideas within that work, and the degree to which they're picked up and circulated amongst a community and mean something to people. And of course, like, you can't write all of that on a CV. I understand that, but how as individuals are we going to maintain that priority, or keep that priority in place? And I think this is sort of a subheading under that issue, how to, make space for ourselves to think for very long periods of time about ideas and about books, while also, if it's necessary, balancing the sort of admin public persona work that we've discussed here.
Those are amazing questions. I was just thinking about the first part of it, and the most pessimistic side of me is like wondering whether internetlessness is going to become a commodity, like a marketable commodity. Like, hey folks, we're going to sell you no Wi-Fi, and that's rare. So let's get into that. I really love your question, and it's so hard because I feel like I've only caught glimpses of that old life, when I have traveled out of the country and so have no service or phone plan, and I can't interact with anyone on the same wavelength, and so I'm left to revert back to like human interaction skill sets. And I just think that what you pointed out, I think you need to it's worth saying that more and more, because I think we slip into norms that are just, we compromise what we're willing to be in we're not even realizing it. We're like a hop, skip, and a jump. Actually, no, we're in a Black Mirror episode, and everything from likes to the viability of other people is predicated on like what, like, it seems so transactional sometimes. And so I have to, this sounds corny, but I think about certain role models, Joan Didion or Arundhati Roy, or folks who like don't release books except maybe once every 10 or 15 years. And I sort of anchor myself to their way of living as an exemplar for some alternative to what the default is now. So right now, my Joan Didion is my like life role model for whatever reason, because I just for X, Y, and Z reason. And I don't know, it's someone different every time. So
Yeah, I also verge into the realm of the corn in answer and considering this question, because I think that what you are demanding is absolutely correct. You are demanding conditions where you can feel free to create, and that is a perfectly reasonable expectation that our modern condition has made it incredibly hard to attain. I guess I'm just going to tell you, because I feel like time is running out, both in this panel and in our time on Earth, that I have had to go through a long and arduous process through failure and mistakes of redefining what success for myself as a writer looks like, and I don't know what your work is or what your specific concerns are. I came to writing first and to scholarship through that. So writing is central to all of my concerns. Writing is how I spend my time. And I realized sometime a few years ago that I had started just straight up future tripping with my entire brain. All I was doing was thinking about what I was going to do when I got that job, that book deal, that whatever it was, that next thing was what was going to bring me in a state where I could finally be coincident with myself, which is absurd. I was coincident with myself all the time. And what I realized as I sort of reached under the hood of my own brain and started to like yank parts around was that I had to redefine success for myself. And success could not be external. It could not be capitalized. It could not be monetized. It could not be quantified. Directly to your question, I realized that for me, success and happiness, if we define happiness as a state of living in coincidence with your values, I realized that success to me as a writer was accessing a state of joy, play, and flow, which Alberto is sick of hearing about because he heard about it this morning. But that is the state where you forget how much time is going by, where you are fully engaged with the present, where you don't want to be anywhere but where you are and what you are doing, where you feel fully absorbed in the task that you feel like has purpose. That to me is success as a writer, like that is what I'm chasing now. That is the North Star for me. And I think that that university life loses track of that sometimes, just like capitalism does. So I think it's important for me at least, to recenter in that value once in a while.
I think I'm going to leave us with those wise words, Laura. Anthony, thank you both so much for, again, taking the time and thinking things through with us. It's really much appreciated. In real world, we would be going out for coffee, maybe walking across the quad, stopping by the Stanford bookstore. I don't know, get some trinkets. But hey, we will do that soon, we hope. And Anthony, we hope you'll be flying up to see us. Nancy, it's fine to stop the recording now.